The dust had barely settled over Jerusalem when word arrived that death was coming for the Crusaders. Only 20 days had passed since the cross had risen again over the Holy City, and already another storm was gathering beyond the southern horizon. A storm made not of wind or sand, but of steel, horses, and vengeance. The banner of the Fatimid Caliphate, emerald green stitched with gold, rose above the plains near Ascalon. Behind it stood an army so vast that the Crusaders first believed the numbers were exaggerated. But the scouts returned pale-faced, swearing by God that the enemy filled the fields like a dark sea. 20,000, 30,000, maybe more. A host gathered for one purpose: to erase the Crusaders and retake Jerusalem forever. Inside the Holy City, the victorious knights were exhausted shadows of themselves. They had marched for 3 years across deserts and mountains, bled in Antioch, starved in Syria, and survived only by the grace of heaven. Now they stood before Jerusalem not as conquering kings, but as gaunt, wounded pilgrims with rusted armor and torn cloaks. And yet they knew something the Fatimids did not. They had fought impossible odds before, and every time, against all logic, they had won. At the center of Jerusalem, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the leaders gathered. Godfrey of Bouillon, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre; Raymond of Toulouse, old but unbroken; Tancred, fierce as fire; and the bishops who carried the relics of the true cross. It was there, in that sacred silence, that Godfrey spoke the words every man would carry on to the battlefield. Brothers, we did not march across the world to die behind walls. If Jerusalem is to be held, we will defend her beyond her gates. A murmur rose: fear, doubt, uncertainty. How could 12,000 starving Crusaders confront an army at least twice or 3 times their size? The answer did not come from a general, but from a priest carrying a relic wrapped in cloth. He revealed it slowly: the true cross, the very wood on which Christ had shed his blood. Every knee bent, every voice fell silent, and suddenly the impossible felt possible. That night, torches flickered across the battlements as the Crusaders prepared to march. No feasting, no songs, only prayer. Some sharpened their swords. Some wrote letters to wives and children they would never see again. Some simply stared at the city and whispered, "Lord, this is your land. If we fall, let us fall in your name." Before dawn, the gates of Jerusalem opened, and for the last time, the crusading army rode out as one not for conquest, but for survival. What awaited them in Ascalon was unlike anything they had seen before. An ocean of troops, war drums echoing across the plains, the Fatimid battle lines stretching farther than the eye could see. And yet, they tightened their grips on sword and shield, because behind them stood the Holy City. Before them stood an empire, and above them stood the cross. Now the march begins. The Crusader column wound south across the Judean hills, like a moving scar of steel and dust. There was no triumph in their march-only determination sharpened by desperation. Every man knew, if they lost, Jerusalem would fall again, and the crusade would be remembered as nothing but a doomed pilgrimage. The sun beat down mercilessly. Many knights wore armor dented from the siege of Jerusalem. Many horses limped, ribs showing through their hides. But still, they pushed forward, because turning back was not an option. Because behind them walked priests, carrying the true cross, held high like a banner of living fire. Wherever that relic passed, men straightened their backs and lifted their eyes. As dawn turned to noon, the Crusaders reached the coastal plains. And then they saw it. The Fatimid army, it stretched across the fields like a black tide. Tents of green silk, war elephants armored in iron plates. Archers by the thousands, spearmen packed so tightly that they looked like a forest of pikes planted in the earth. Historians estimate 20 to 30,000 troops. Some even claim more. To the Crusaders marching with barely 12,000, it felt like the whole world had come to crush them. But instead of stopping, the Crusaders formed a line. Godfrey ordered the infantry forward, shields overlapping into an iron wall. To his right rode Tancred and the Norman cavalry hungry, for the kind of battle they believed God himself had promised them. On the left, Raymond positioned the Provencals, the veterans of Antioch, men who had already stared death in the face and did not blink. A hot wind swept across the plains, carrying with it the smell of the sea, and something else. Bravery, fear, destiny. Suddenly, a scout galloped toward Godfrey, dust exploding behind him. He dismounted and knelt. "My lord, the Fatimids are preparing to surround us." Godfrey didn't hesitate. He raised his voice so all could hear. "Then we strike first. No counsel, no hesitation, no waiting for reinforcements that would never come." The Crusaders advanced. Priests walked behind them, chanting in Latin. Some knights rode with tears in their eyes, not from fear, but from the burning knowledge that this battle would decide the fate of the Holy City forever. When they were close enough to see the whites of the enemy's eyes, Raymond lifted the relic of the true cross and shouted, "In nomen Christi," in the name of Christ. The entire Crusader line roared back in unison. The Fatimid drums thundered. Elephants bellowed. Arrows darkened the sky, and then steel met flesh. Shield crashed against shield. The earth itself seemed to shake. The Battle of Ascalon had begun. The first shock of the armies colliding was like thunder ripping through the plains. The Fatimid front ranks slammed into the Crusader shield wall, their spears rattling against oak and iron. Crusader infantry braced their feet in the dirt, shoulders locked, teeth clenched, the weight of an entire empire pressing down on them. Arrows fell like rain. The sky darkened for a heartbeat. Men cried out not in fear, but in stubborn refusal to fall. Behind the line, Godfrey rode slow and deliberate, his massive sword resting across his saddle. He watched every movement like a hawk. He had fought too many battles to be fooled by the chaos. He knew where the real danger was forming, and where the smallest crack could become a victory. And then he saw it. A unit of Fatimid cavalry was maneuvering along the right flank, trying to sweep around and hit the infantry from behind. It was a textbook move, deadly, efficient, the kind that had broken countless armies before. Godfrey didn't wait for confirmation. He pointed his sword toward the flank. Norman's ride. Tancred heard the order before the wind even carried it. He raised his lance. He shouted something half Italian, half prayer, and the Norman cavalry thundered forward like unleashed wolves. Their horses were exhausted, underfed, some barely standing, but when they charged, they exploded with a fury that startled even their Christian allies. They slammed into the Fatimid cavalry like a hammer striking glass. Screams, steel, the crack of splintering wood. Men were thrown from saddles. Lances pierced armor, shields shattered. Tancred himself skewered a commander so hard that his lance snapped in two and he had to draw his sword mid-gallop. The Fatimid flank faltered. That was all Godfrey needed. He stood in his stirrups, voice rising above the chaos. For Jerusalem, push forward. The infantry surged. Knights leaned into their reins, driving deeper into enemy lines. The Fatimid commanders couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their scouts had reported starving, ragged Crusaders, exhausted from months of siege warfare. What charged toward them now was something entirely different. Men who believed heaven itself was watching. On the left flank, Raymond of Toulouse lifted the true cross higher, sunlight catching on the gold casing. Fatimid soldiers slowed. Some hesitated. A symbol that powerful, carried into battle with such unbreakable conviction, had a way of cutting deeper than swords. Seeing the hesitation, Raymond shouted, "Christ walks with us! Strike!" The Provencal knights charged, smashing into the Fatimid infantry. Shields broke. Spears flew. The Fatimid center began to bend under the pressure. And then, for the first time since dawn, the impossible happened. The Muslim line cracked. A ripple of panic spread through the ranks. Commanders shouted orders. Elephants bellowed in confusion. Archers scrambled to reposition. What was supposed to be an easy encirclement had turned into a desperate struggle to hold formation. Godfrey saw the break and whispered a prayer. "Lord, let this be the hour." He lowered his visor, raised his sword, and prepared for the decisive blow. Godfrey did not need horns or drums. When the crack opened in the Fatimid line, every knight who fought beside him felt it in their bones. It was the shift all warriors recognized the moment. The enemy begins to fear you. He lowered his great sword until it pointed straight at the gap. Jerusalem! With me! 10 Baldwin Tancred Raymond of Rhee, commander still able to lift a weapon, fell into formation behind him. 200 knights, battered, sunburned, armor patched and dented, gathered for one final strike. A Muslim chronicler later wrote that they looked like men already dead, who marched without fear. Another wrote that their charge fell upon the field like thunder falling from a clear sky. Godfrey spurred his horse, and the charge began. No trumpet, no fanfare, just the sudden earth-shaking roar of hooves pounding against the plains of Ascalon. The Fatimid troops tried to close ranks, but they were a heartbeat too slow. The Crusader wedge drove straight into the opening, cutting the army in half like a blade through sailcloth. Spears shattered on shields, horses collided with shields, men were thrown into the air, crushed under hooves, trampled into the dust. Godfrey hacked down a standard-bearer, then another, then a third. Each fallen banner widened the panic. Raymond of Toulouse, riding with the true cross held high, shouted over the din, "Stand firm. Christ is with us." And the men believed him. They fought like men who knew heaven was watching. Tancred, wild-eyed and unstoppable, tore through enemy ranks like a storm. He leaped from one dying horse to another, refused to fall, refused to break. Later, a knight swore he saw him bleeding from 5 wounds, yet still swinging his sword with both hands. The Fatimid commanders attempted a desperate counterattack. Armored cavalry and elephant corps, the pride of the Egyptian army. The elephants roared, draped in war armor, driving straight toward the Crusader center. But they had never faced men like these. The knights split formation just long enough to let the beasts charge through, then collapsed around them, stabbing upward into soft flesh beneath the armor. The elephants panicked, turned, and trampled their own soldiers. The Fatimid line, already strained, began to buckle. Then it bent. Then finally, inevitably, it collapsed. What happened next was not a battle. That was a rout. Tens of thousands began to flee toward the coast, abandoning shields, helmets, entire camps. The dust cloud rising behind them could be seen from miles away. Some threw their weapons into the sand. Others begged their officers for orders that never came. The Crusaders pushed them harder. Godfrey didn't slow. Baldwin didn't slow. Not a single knight paused to breathe. They knew what was happening. They weren't just winning. They were breaking the will of an empire. And the moment the Fatimids realized the Christians would not stop, that these starved, exhausted, outnumbered men refused to yield even an inch. The battle was decided. The sun climbed higher, lighting the field of Ascalon, and in that light, Baldwin turned to Godfrey and shouted, "Brother, the Lord has given them into our hands." Godfrey did not answer. He just pressed forward for the killing blow. By mid-morning, the battlefield of Ascalon was no longer a clash of armies. It was a tide breaking in slow motion. The Fatimid forces, once a disciplined war machine, had dissolved into knots of terrified men sprinting across the plains, dropping shields as they ran. But the knights pressed harder. This was not cruelty. This was necessity. They knew that if the Fatimids regrouped, if even a fraction of their 30,000 men turned back, the fragile Christian kingdom would be crushed within days. So Godfrey rode like an executioner of empires. He caught the enemy's left flank first. His sword rose and fell in arcs that looked almost impossible, each strike clearing space around him. His horse mud-spattered, bleeding from the shoulder, charged, with a fury mirrored in its rider. Akkadi, who witnessed the charge, later wrote, "Some men fight for land, some are for gold." These fought as if the skies were opening behind them. The ground trembled under the hooves of pursuit. Every Crusader foot soldier or knight became a force of nature. Arrows whistled past them. A few found their mark, but the knights did not slow. They couldn't. They would not. And then at the very heart of the chaos they found the Fatimid command encampment. Silk tents, supplies stacked high, treasure caravans, war banners bearing the insignia of the Vizier al-Afdal. It was here that the battle truly ended. Al-Afdal, who had marched north, confident that he would crush the infidel kingdom in a single stroke, watched in horror as his elite guard scattered. His war elephants were gone. His cavalry fled. His infantry were throwing down their spears and begging for mercy. He ordered a final defensive line. It lasted minutes. Baldwin himself broke its shield up, sword flashing like a shard of sunlight. His men crashed behind him, smashing through the guard-like waves, breaking on rock. Raymond of Toulouse, carrying the true cross, advanced with steady, unshakable steps, chanting a psalm even as arrows clattered against his armor. When the guard fell, al-Afdal understood he would not win. He would not even stand. He fled on horseback, abandoning his banners, his supplies, his wealth, everything, and the knights surged into the command tents. What they found inside stunned even them. Mountains of gold, weapons for an entire campaign, silks, spices, armor, war drums, supplies enough to starve a kingdom into surrender. All of it left behind in the panic. A chronicler of the First Crusade wrote, "It was as if the Lord had opened his hand and poured victory onto the field." But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because, while the Fatimids fled toward Egypt, Godfrey gathered his commanders. Dust covered their faces. Blood streaked their armor. Their horses trembled beneath them, but their eyes burned with the same fire. Godfrey raised his sword once more. "Brothers, Jerusalem is watching." And they spurred their horses forward. The rout became a hunt. The plains shook beneath them. The legend of Ascalon, of a few hundred knights shattering an army, was carved into history that day, and the world would never forget it. The Fatimid crescent had shattered, but a broken army is still an army, and a fleeing force of tens of thousands can crush itself into a tidal wave of chaos that becomes just as deadly as battle. Dust billowed across the plains of Ascalon, like a rising storm cloud, swallowing the horizon in a yellow-gray haze. The ground trembled beneath the stampede of terrified men, horses and camels fleeing in every direction. Baldwin raised his sword to the sun. "Drive them while their fear is upon them. Drive them!" At once, the 500 knights surged forward again, not as a line, but as a sweeping arc, splitting into wings that curved around the fleeing columns. Their horses were slick with sweat, their armor dust-covered, their faces streaked with grit and blood, but their spirits burned with an almost supernatural fire. It was the moment every mounted warrior trained for. The pursuit, the collapse, the breaking of an enemy so thoroughly that it would never return. To the Fatimids, the knights must have looked like phantom shapes emerging from the dust, steel glinting, hooves pounding like drums of doom. They screamed that the Franks were endless, that every time they looked back, there were more. Panic sharpened into terror. A Mamluk commander tried to form a rearguard. He stood on a ridge, shouting orders, rallying archers and spearmen in a last attempt to halt the Christian surge. Bohemond spotted him. With a single gesture, he signaled a dozen knights, and they charged the ridge in a slanted formation, kicking up a storm of dust. The Mamluks unleashed a volley of arrows, a dark sheet rising into the air, but the knights rode under it, using the dust cloud as a shield. They hit the ridge like a hammer. The line collapsed instantly. The commander fell beneath a crush of hooves. A portion of the Fatimid cavalry broke into a frantic gallop toward the south, hoping to regroup beyond the dunes. But Tancred saw the movement and cut them off with surgical precision, slamming into their flanks so hard that several of their horses flipped sideways, crashing into their own riders. Dust swallowed the screams. Steel flashed. Then, silence. The Fatimid south flank was gone. In the middle of the retreating army, thousands trampled one another. Officers shouted for order, but their voices vanished beneath the roar of collapsing discipline. Shields, bows, saddlebags, helmets, all cast aside to flee faster. Some tried to run toward the coast. Others back toward Ascalon's walls. Still others into the open desert. But Baldwin cut them off at every turn. He led his knights across the field in a sweeping, circular pattern, creating the illusion of a far larger force. Every time the Fatimids tried to rally, a cluster of armored riders would appear from the haze and crush the attempt before it could form. It wasn't just victory, it was domination. And word began to spread among the fleeing soldiers, whispered in terror, that these knights were not merely men, that they were the warriors of Christ, invulnerable, tireless, relentless. Some dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, praying to be spared. Others fled deeper into confusion, shouting that the Franks were angels of death. The knights pressed the pursuit until the Fatimids abandoned their greatest prize, their war camp. The largest they had ever assembled in Palestine, it stretched across the plain like a city of silk and leather. Colored banners fluttered, food supplies, weapons, horses, treasure. Everything lay undefended. The Fatimids had been so sure of victory that they had brought lusaries, gold ornaments, engraved shields, medicine chests, fine fabrics, spices, even silver tables and ceremonial armor meant for the triumph they expected. Baldwin reined in his horse. "Take it," he said. "Take it all. It is the Lord's provision." The knights erupted into cheers, but even as they entered the camp, Baldwin did something no chronicler ever forgot. He turned back toward the battlefield. Because for him, victory wasn't the camp. It wasn't the loot. It wasn't even the destruction of the Fatimid army. It was what the victory meant. That 500 men, united in faith, courage, and desperation, had defeated the might of an empire. That Jerusalem, claimed only a year before, was now safe. That God had answered their courage with deliverance. And as he looked out across the smoking plain, Baldwin spoke softly, almost to himself. "Christ fought with us." When the dust began to settle, the battlefield at Ascalon revealed a sight so staggering that even the hardened veterans among Baldwin's men struggled to believe what they were seeing. Tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, shattered, scattered, running for their lives. 500 Christian knights, exhausted, bleeding, but standing victorious. The desert wind carried only one truth. Christendom had just witnessed a miracle of war. For the Fatimid army, the retreat turned into a catastrophe so complete that chroniclers could only describe it as God's judgment on the battlefield. The corpses of camels and horses lay tangled in broken equipment. Banners were trampled into the dirt. Shields were discarded in heaps, and everywhere, abandoned in the sand, were thousands of curved sabers. Most dropped without ever tasting Christian steel. Chroniclers later wrote that the Fatimid forces fled, as if pursued by the wrath of heaven itself, and many of their officers agreed. Reports from escaping survivors told the same story. "They came at us like iron lions, and the desert moved with them." Then came the number that stunned the entire medieval world. Christian casualties, fewer than 100 soldiers. Not 500. Not 1,000. Not even a fraction of the enemy losses. Less than 100 men had fallen in a battle against an army of at least 20,000. The church would call it divine protection. The knights would call it the mercy of Christ. Even some Muslim chroniclers acknowledged it as a day favored by the Christian God. Baldwin called it something else. Proof that courage is sanctified when Christ is your captain. When the knights fully entered the abandoned Fatimid camp, they found wealth so immense that it seemed unreal. Tents embroidered with gold thread, chests of pearls and coins, silk garments meant for victory parades in Egypt. War elephants, saddles, though no elephants had survived the retreat, and food stores large enough to supply an entire army for months. Some knights wept when they saw it. Others fell to their knees in thanksgiving. And Baldwin, now standing at the center of this vast treasure, removed his helmet and raised it to the sky. "Jerusalem will not starve," he said. "Not this year, not while God walks with us." News of the defeat struck Cairo like lightning. The Fatimid viziers were speechless. Messengers galloped through the night, delivering report after report describing the impossible. 500 knights had destroyed their greatest invasion army. The Caliph himself reportedly asked if the chroniclers were exaggerating. But the surviving commanders confirmed the truth. One soldier even said, "We saw judgment with our own eyes." It was Commander Jahwa al-Misri after Ascalon, The Fatimids hesitated for years before attempting another major invasion of the Latin kingdom. Jerusalem, which many thought would fall within months, remained safe. Baldwin and his 500 rode back to Jerusalem like men returning from the dead. Word spread faster than their horses could travel. Villagers lined the roads. Priests rang bells that had not tolled since the Great Liberation. Mothers lifted their children to see the warriors who had saved the Holy City. And when Baldwin entered Jerusalem, something happened that no chronicler failed to record. The people began chanting, "Deus vult! Deus vult! God wills it!" Not as a cry for war, but as a cry of gratitude. Because the victory at Ascalon proved something almost unbelievable. The Holy Land did not survive because it was strong. It survived because faith filled the weak with impossible strength. That night, Baldwin went alone into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. No knights, no fanfare, no crown, just a man kneeling before the tomb of Christ. He placed his sword on the stone and whispered, "Not by my hand, Lord, by yours. Let this victory be remembered, not for our glory, but for yours." And there, in the quiet of the holiest place in Christendom, Baldwin wept, not from sorrow, but from awe, because he knew something few ever understand. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is obedience to God despite fear. Ascalon was the proof. When the sun rose the next morning over the battlefield of Ascalon, it revealed not just victory, but a turning point for Christian history. The sand was littered with abandoned shields, shattered spears, and the footprints of an army that had fled in terror. And the 500 knights who remained standing looked less like men and more like the steel edge of a divine blade. Across the Middle East, rumors spread faster than armies. Some whispered the Christians had been aided by angels. Others claimed they saw a rider in white leading the charge, a figure who vanished in the smoke. A Fatimid officer swore he saw arrows pass through the Christian knights, as if the air itself fought for them. And in the courts of Syria and Egypt, one phrase began circulating: "Do not face the Franks in open field, for their God is a God of war." It wasn't meant as praise. It was meant as admission. In Europe, the news arrived months later, carried by exhausted messengers and pilgrims who had seen the aftermath. But when the story spread from Rome to Paris to the small villages of the Rhine, men stood up in crowded taverns and churches to say, "Jerusalem lives." Bards turned Baldwin's 500 into legend. Monks recorded it as a miracle. Families taught it to their children for generations. It became the proof that, when all seems lost, God does not fight with numbers. He fights with faith. After Ascalon, the Fatimids never again launched a direct invasion of Jerusalem with such overwhelming numbers. Years later, Muslim chroniclers admitted the truth. The Christians fight as if each man carries the strength of 100. Ibn al-Athiyah chronicles of the Levant, and they were right. Ascalon shattered the myth that the Crusaders were temporary occupiers. It forced the surrounding Muslim powers to reassess the Latin kingdom, not as a fragile foothold, but as a rising force. For the next decade, King Baldwin used the psychological shock of Ascalon to solidify his kingdom. He fortified the routes to Jerusalem. He secured the coastal towns. He turned desperate pilgrims into disciplined defenders of the Holy Land. And each time his knights rode into battle, enemies recalled Ascalon and hesitated. Historians today call the victory at Ascalon the miracle of the desert, the last charge of the First Crusade, the battle that saved Jerusalem. Because without it, the Christian kingdom would have ended before it began. Had the Fatimids won, Baldwin would have fallen. Jerusalem would have been retaken. The Crusader states would have vanished. The First Crusade would be remembered as a failure. Instead, 500 men changed the destiny of Christendom. As the years passed, the names of the knights who rode with Baldwin faded into legend. Many were poor men who left Europe with nothing but a dream. Some died in later battles. Some settled in the Holy Land. Some simply disappeared into the dust of history. But chroniclers preserved a few stories. One unnamed knight was recorded leaving all treasure behind to take only a single item, a small wooden cross he found in the ruins of a burned village. He told Baldwin, "Gold feeds the body, this feeds the soul." A boy of only 16, who carried the banner of Jerusalem during the entire charge, returned home decades later. His grandchildren wrote that he never once raised his voice except when speaking about the battle. He would stand, straighten his back, and whisper, "I saw God turn lions into sheep and turn lambs into lions." A priest, traveling with the army, walked the battlefield afterward, giving final blessings to both Christian and Fatimid dead. When asked why he prayed over the enemy, he answered, "Because God saw them fall. And so must I." These men, knights and priests, nobles and farmers, formed the backbone of the victory. They were not perfect. They were not angels. They were not invincible. But they were faithful, and faith, that day, made them terrifying. Years later, when King Baldwin died, he was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the same church where he prayed after Ascalon. His tombstone did not glorify him as a king. It did not list his victories. It did not boast of empire. It reads, "King of Jerusalem, who knew the strength of Christ." Because Baldwin understood something eternal. Victories earned by men are forgotten. Victories given by God become legend. And Ascalon, the day 500 knights stood against an ocean of steel and lived, has remained one of the greatest battlefield miracles in all of Christian history.